All right, now it's time to put our newfound Checkout.js knowledge to test by doing a series of exercises, starting off with a basic REST integration. So we are onboarding a brand new merchant that has no previous ties to PayPal, and since this merchant has no existing integration, we have sold them on using the REST APIs. The merchant wants to immediately execute the payment when the customer is returned from the PayPal flow. So let's go ahead and open up the rest.html file to complete this integration. And we will locate part 1 section and go ahead and pause this video and take a couple minutes to try and solve this part on your own and follow the inline comments to complete. All right, if you haven't done so, please pause the video because I'm about to go through the answers. So now if we open up client checkout rest.html, we'll see our file. And part 1, we are completing the payment function to return or resolve a REST pay ID. Remember that payment always has to return or resolve some sort of a token. So we are going to use the PayPal library to make the REST call to create a payment. If you didn't do so, you should have went to the GitHub docs listed here to see how they are currently doing the REST call. But we are going to return paypal.rest.payment.create. And we are returning it because this function actually returns a promise, so then we're just returning it, and then when it resolves, it will resolve the pay ID. So use the following variables as arguments: environment, client, and transaction. So I could have just copied these 3. All right, and that should be what we need for part 1 of this exercise. We can't really test it yet because we haven't even rendered a component, but that will be what we do in the next part. All right, so there's the answer for part 1 of this exercise. Let's take a moment to copy it down if you haven't already. All right, moving on to part 2, we're actually going to create the button component. So locate part 2 section in your rest.html and then pause this video and take a couple minutes to try and solve this part on your own and follow the inline comments to complete. All right, if you haven't done so, please pause the video now because I'm about ready to go through the answers to this part. Let's switch back to our training application and find part 2. It says create the button component integration. Once again, you should probably have went to the documentation to see how the syntax is actually formatted. I'm going to go through and create the button component now. So we have PayPal.button.render. So remember, our render is the function on the X component that renders the button in the iframe. And the argument you pass it is an object, and this is the ID, so it'd be PayPal-button. Just easier for me to get the entire function call and then configure the object. All right, so then it says set env property to the environment variable. So we're going to say env equals environment. And then we're going to say client equals client variable. And it says call the on error on error. So on error. on cancel, on cancel. All right, so it says execute the payment function in the correct event callback. So we know that we actually want to call the payment function in the payment callback. And then execute the execute payment function, which we haven't actually defined yet. And actually it's called unauthorized. So I'll have to fix that in your training documentation. It will be called unauthorized. So we want to execute the unauthorized, unauthorized. All right, so it says make sure you configure so that there's a Pay Now button, which means that we have to add the commit property to true. And then make the button, so we're going to style it. And we want it to be a size medium. Want its color to be blue. And we want its shape to be rectangle. All right, so that should actually create our button component. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and refresh. I'm going to go to our actual rest.html in our application here, and we should be able to see the PayPal button, which we do. At this point, we should actually be able to click it as well because we did the payment function. One thing to note, there is a bug in Mac and Chrome where if you are in full screen mode, you actually get a new tab that pops up when you're in pop-up mode. All right. So here's the answer for part 2. Go ahead and take a moment and copy it down if you didn't get it all. Otherwise, we are going to move on to part 3. So before we move on to part 3, we're just going to go over the unauthorized actions a little bit. We saw in our deep dive that the unauthorized callback receives some actions, and the table below describes them in detail. So this is what we saw messaged back to the merchant site from the button iframe. And you'll see, you can look, if you set a breakpoint in that unauthorized callback, you can actually view the actions. So the close closes the modal, but not the overlay. Payment execute executes the rest payment. Payment.get executes the rest payment.get. This would be useful for mimicking like the get express checkout functionality where you want to get the payer's information. Redirect redirects the parent window to either the return or the cancel URL. And then the restart restarts the PayPal flow, which can be used for 10486 failures. All right, so now let's locate part 3 in our rest.html. Go ahead and pause this video and take a couple minutes to try and solve this part on your own and follow the inline comments to complete. All right, if you haven't done so, please pause the video now because I'm about ready to go over the answers for this part. All right, right, so let's go ahead and locate section 3 in our training app, which is the unauthorized function. It says complete the unauthorized callback. Use the information passed to this function to execute the payment, and then call the handle response function. So you probably have to search around a little bit in the documentation to find out how to actually execute the payment, or we just saw it in our deep dive and we saw it in our table. So actions has a method, has an object called payment, which has a method called execute. And then that actual method doesn't even take any arguments. So we just execute it. And it says then, so that returns a promise. We are going to call the handle response function. And since the execute returns a promise, we're going to return right after we execute the all right, so that should execute our payment. So if I go ahead and save this, and I go through my payment flow, it should execute the payment when we return back from PayPal. Once again, it's opening a new tab because there is a limitation in Chrome on Mac. But the process flow still works. It just opens it in a new tab instead of a pop-up window. So you'll notice the Pay Now button. Then you'll notice it closed down, and we executed the payment. We actually have a pay ID, a transaction ID. It was a sale, so it was approved. So this transaction actually went through. All right, so here's the answer to part 3. You can copy it down if you didn't get it before. And then we saw that we were able to go through the full payment flow, and we saw something similar to this. And that is it for this exercise.